Hi, this is Laura Rogers, and I'm going to show you today how to use SharePoint Designer workflows to create a travel request system that has 2 levels of approval. So I'm going to show you this workflow diagram and refer back to it as I go. So first we have when the new travel request is created, then we have an event that says, has a traveler ever filled out a request before? And if they haven't, then they have to fill out some traveler information just about themselves. It's got preferences having to do with travel, whether they like smoking, non-smoking rooms, window seats, aisle seats on airplanes, and things like that. But if they have already filled out one of those, then the request is sent to the approver for their department for approval. And then after that approver approves it, then the request is going to be sent to a chief travel officer for approval. And then, once the chief travel officer approves it, then that's the end. And at each point, if it gets rejected, then the email gets sent to the originator that it was rejected. So to start out, I'm going to go ahead and create a workflow in SharePoint Designer on this travel request list. Create travel. And I'm going to have this workflow started each time a new item is created, which would be a new travel request. My first step in this workflow, I'm going to call it Check New Traveler. And this is where we check to see if the person has ever filled out a travel request before, because we have a separate list on the site just for traveler information called Travelers. The idea in this workflow is that each travel request is going to have a traveler associated with it. So there's only going to be one traveler, but that one traveler can have several different travel requests associated with each one traveler. So this is how it would work. So we have Laura Rogers, it's got several different requests, and Mark Miller could have several different requests. But once that traveler has filled out their traveler information once, the workflow is going to look to see if that record, that full name exists, and it's going to match it up with the requester field. The requester field is simply the created by field, just the default created by field in the custom list, and I renamed it and called it requester. Back to SharePoint Designer. To check for new traveler, what we're going to do is our condition. We're going to compare any data source. I'm going to see if the requester field needs to match a workflow lookup of the traveler, and that traveler field is the full name. And also, when we look up to another list, we have to pick which field matches the other list. So just using that graphic that I just showed you that showed the fields that match, this is where we pick the matching fields. So traveler's full name matches with the current item requester. And yes, I am sure that it's going to be unique because each item in the travelers list, that traveler is only going to be in the list once, so that's okay. So if the condition the traveler requester equals traveler full name, which means the traveler already exists, then basically the workflow, we're just going to move on. So we don't even need to put an action in there. Otherwise, if the traveler doesn't already exist, we're going to create a new item. So we're going to pick create list item in the travelers list. Our company, this is internal, so our company is always going to be the same. So it's a required field, but it's just going to be Acme. And then full name is the current item requester. We also have a number of trips field that's going to count up the number of trips that one person goes on. So we're going to set that to 0. And once that actual travel request gets approved, then the number will get changed to 1. So we're going to call this variable new traveler. So we've created the new item, and then we're going to store the URL to the new item. So to store that sort of complex variable, we're going to build a dynamic string. So this dynamic string needs to go to our travelers list edit field. So let's see if we have some travelers in here. When I click edit to edit this Mark Miller traveler, this URL up here is what I need. So I need it all the way up to ID equals. So we want to copy this so that when the email gets sent out, then it gets sent out with a link straight to for that person to be able to edit the form for their own traveler information. So ID equals the current item's ID. And you'll see how this works in a few minutes. I'm going to call this traveler URL, this variable. So after I have created the variable, then I need to actually send the email to the traveler. When I want to pick a field in a current item, I use that workflow lookup option. Traveler information needed. Now this is where I put the workflow variable that we just created called traveler URL inside this HTML in my email. Please click here to fill out your travel information, etc. And you can actually put any HTML in this email body that you like. So I have sent an email, created an item in Travelers, and sent an email if the traveler doesn't already exist. Otherwise, I'm moving on. So I'm going to go ahead and add my next workflow step. Now, both of these items are going to move on, but this one is just not going to do all this other, creating the traveler stuff. So this first condition moves on, and then the second condition otherwise does all these things, and then it moves on too. So they're both going to go to step 2. In step 2, we're going to call first approval. So all we're going to do, the only action that we're going to have in this step is to collect data. So we're going to collect data from this user. Now this is where we actually use SharePoint task, a SharePoint task list and reference in our workflow. So as soon as we start going through these tutorials to collect data from this user, content types are actually being created behind the scenes and being associated with the first task list that it finds on our site. And if a task list doesn't exist already, it's going to create one. So if you have several task lists, it's going to pick the first one in the alphabet. So to collect data from this user, it starts your little wizard. And I'm going to call this department approval. So this task is called department approval. And here's our description. We click next. This is where we can put the field that we'd like the person to fill in. So in this case, it's just whether they approve or reject it. So the field's name is approval, and put a description. Make it a choice field, and here are our choices. So who am I going to ask this question to? Who am I going to collect this data from? Well, the way this department approval works is, let me see. Okay, so we looked at the travel requests compared to the travelers. Now I'm going to look at the travel requests compared to the approvers. So when we fill out a travel request, we actually have a department field to fill out, which looks up from a department list on the site. We also have an approvers list on the site that has a department field that looks up from that same list of departments, just so they're congruent. So each department has its own individual that is going to be selected to approve that department's travel request. So this approver name column would really, in real life, it would have a different person for each department. So each time we create a travel request, this workflow is going to look at what department you are coming from, and it's going to find the matching person. So if it's the department is IT, it's going to find the approver that goes with that department name. So this is what we have to do next in the workflow. So from this user, workflow lookup, and this is where we have to pick the approvers list. Approver name. Now when we pick a list, a different list than the current list we're working in, like for example, the list we're working in that we started the workflow on is the travel request list. Whenever in our workflow we point to a different list that exists on the site, we have to say which field is associated with that list. So in this case, this would be the field that we just looked at, which would be the department. So the department in the approvers list is going to be the same as the department in the current item. So that's going to be the common field. Yes. So and then we're gonna have this question asked to us anytime we're not using an ID field, because an ID field is always going to be unique. So SharePoint Designer says, okay, I trust you if you're using an ID field. Otherwise, they're going to give you this one. So it's collecting department approval from the approver name, and the variable is going to be, just call it department approval task ID. That's really long. So the next step in our workflow is going to be, once this task is completed, have they approved or rejected it? So basically, SharePoint Designer workflow is just going to sit here and wait. So the next step in here, really, it doesn't show it, but when it collects approval information, when it collects any kind of task information, the workflow is going to just simply wait and be in progress while it's waiting for this approval to be filled in on the task. So our next workflow step is going to be department approval response. So once they fill out their approval, what happens? So we're going to have if they approve it for our first condition, and if they reject it as the other condition. So if compare any data source. This is where we get to look up to the task list, because we have actually created a task and pulled in a variable. So this variable, department approval task ID, is going to be the unique ID of the task that is created at this step. So if we look back at our graphics here, when we collect this approval, this task ID, see here's the ID field in the task list. and this task ID is a workflow variable that our workflow was stored. So in the task list field, department approval. So we pick the tasks department approval field, and then we have to match up that field with the field in our current list or current workflow. So the tasks unique ID, just like I showed you here, the task unique ID is going to match with that variable that we created in this case. And in this case, this was the department approval task ID. If task department approval equals reject, then we're going to send an email to the requester. Sorry, dude. So funny, because I was working on a project recently, and they didn't want to use the word rejected. They just wanted to say request not approved. We didn't ever want to use the word rejected because we didn't want to hurt anybody's feelings. So not approved. And then it said, then we can put some variables in here if we like. Your request to go to where? Destination has been denied at the department level. So if it gets rejected, they get an email. So if this travel request gets rejected, then the requester gets an email, and then the content approval status is going to be set to rejected. So we have content approval turned on this travel request list. And we can stop the workflow. We don't want it to go any further. So we don't need to put an else if statement in here, because if it's rejected, it stops, does all these things and stops. But then if it's approved, it's just going to go on to the next step. So the next step is going to be Chief Travel Officer approval. So this is another case where we're simply going to collect data from the user, and that's the only step. So we're going to collect the CTO approval. We're going to collect the Chief Travel Officer approval. And we're going to have that approve or reject choice. Radio button, finish. And we're going to call this, let's see, we're going to collect this from. Now, you could just type an email address in here and have the email address hard-coded in the workflow, but I like to just use a SharePoint group for this. So I created a group called Chief Travel Officer, and you can just simply put that one person in the group. But that way, if that person goes on vacation or if they want their secretary to do some of these, then all you have to do is put those different people in the SharePoint group, and you don't have to modify the workflow just for little things like that. CTO task is going to be our new variable. And we're going to have another step called Cto Response. So we're going to look up to that task list again. Cto approval. And that ID, just like I showed you in the graphic, the ID is going to equal our workflow data, the Cto task ID. Equals reject, then we're going to do the same thing. We're going to send an email and set the content approval. Again, we're sending it to the same person, which you can pick requester in here. That's going to be the same thing as the user who created the current item. See, it picks requester, so it's just a little shortcut. Travel rejected by Cto. Okay, so we send the email and then we set the content approval status to rejected. So if this travel is not rejected, that means it is approved. So when the travel is approved, we're going to send an email to the person who created the current item, the requester, to say their travel, yay, their travel was accepted. Now in here we can even put some more detailed information. We're going to use the current item ID in a URL. Click here to open request, just in case they want to reference it. So after we send them an email, we're going to do a calculation. So this the number of trips field that we have in the travelers list, we want to add 1 to it. So first we have to do a calculation. We're going to take the travelers list and the number of trips. And so what fields match up with this list and the travelers list? Well, the travelers list, again, full name matches with the current item's requester field. So we're going to take the number of trips they've already taken plus 1, and that variable can be called add 1, and that's a number. And then we are going to update the list. So we update an item in the travelers list, number of trips, to our new workflow variable we just created called add1. And this section down here, again, you have to pick the matching fields. So where full name is equal to the current item's requester field. Yes. Last thing to do is to set the content approval status to approved. Okay, so now that we've created our travel request workflow, the next thing to do is to try it out. So I'm going to create a new travel request. Where am I going? I'm going to Boston. So now I've filled out all of my information. Click OK. So now that I've created the item, that's kicking off the workflow. So since I have not filled out traveler information yet, so I'm a new traveler, I should be getting an email having my new traveler question. So now I've received the email that I created. So it says, click here to fill in your traveler information to associate with this request. Which takes me to my empty form. So I just need to fill out all the information, my credit card information, billing information, frequent flyer. So this is just so the travel department has everyone's information. Fill out a couple of fields and click OK. So in the real world, you would have whatever fields you need probably required. So here's my travel information. Now the workflow is actually running in the background. It is sending approval information to whoever's in charge of the department that I sent my request to. So in my request, I said that I was in the IT department. So in my approvers list, of course, obviously in the real world it wouldn't be me, but I'm going to be the IT department. Now there are a couple of different ways you can have these emails sent for the approval tasks. You could have just regular task emails turned on. So if I go to list settings, advanced settings, have, send the email when ownership is assigned. If I have that to yes, then these people would automatically just get the standard task email from SharePoint saying that they have a task assigned to them. So you could also have a workflow associated with this task list and create a different workflow that would send an email each time someone is assigned a workflow, send them an email immediately. So this is the task that for department approval that's associated with my travel request. And here's another way I can go get to it. In my workflows, in the drop down for my workflow status, it's going to show me any and all tasks associated with it. So I'm going to go ahead and go into this task and complete it. So here are these fields that I created within the workflow to approve or reject. So I'm going to approve it and complete the task. And then you can see that I can also open the associated request to take a look at it again. Now what's going on with this workflow? So I'm going to go ahead and refresh this status page. So the workflow has moved on. So new travel request was created. The new traveler information was created. The request was sent for approval by a department approver. And then the request was sent to the Chief Travel Officer for approval. So here's my Chief Travel Officer task that got created. And now he wants to approve it and complete the task. And now I'm going to refresh this again. oh my goodness, my travel was approved. So this is that email that we created, and I can click to open the request if I'd like to go look at it. Refresh this workflow page one more time, and the whole thing has been completed. How cool. So that is how to create a two-stage approval workflow in a travel request system. Thank you.